The stage lights dimmed to a single spotlight as Marcus Kane, the Grammy-winning pop sensation known for his sharp wit and even sharper tongue, stepped up to the microphone at London's O2 Arena. It was November 15, 2024, and what started as another routine concert would become the most talked-about performance in modern music history. "You know what I love about world leaders today?" Marcus began, his signature smirk playing across his lips as 20,000 fans erupted in anticipation. They knew that look. It meant someone was about to get roasted. They're all so predictable. Same suits, same speeches, same empty promises. The crowd laughed, eating up every word. Marcus had built his career on controversy. From his early days as a street performer in Manchester to selling out stadiums worldwide, his ability to blend music with social commentary had made him both beloved and reviled in equal measure. Tonight felt different, though. There was an edge to his voice, a tension that even his most devoted fans couldn't quite place. "But then you have these African leaders," he continued, his voice taking on a mocking tone that would haunt him for months to come. "Take this guy, Ibrahim Traoré. Ever heard of him?" A few scattered cheers came from the audience, but most remained silent, unsure where this was heading. Marcus pulled out his phone, displaying a photo of the young Burkinabe leader on the massive screens behind him. 34 years old, running a country. Looks like he should be delivering my pizza, not making political decisions. The crowd's laughter was more nervous now, sensing they were witnessing something that crossed a line. "I mean, seriously, what qualifications does this kid have? Military coup? Please. In my day, we called that a tantrum." Marcus was fully committed now, his voice dripping with condescension. "These African leaders, they're all the same. Big talk, bigger promises, and then nothing. Corruption, poverty, chaos. It's like watching a broken record, except the record is on fire and taking the whole continent with it." The arena fell uncomfortably quiet. This wasn't the playful ribbing Marcus was known for. This was something darker, more personal. But he couldn't stop himself. The adrenaline, the lights, the power of having 20,000 people hanging on his every word. It was intoxicating. And don't get me started on their so-called revolutionary ideas. Pan-Africanism? Anti-imperialism? It's 2024, not 1960. Wake up and smell the coffee, or in their case, wake up and smell the economic failure. His words echoed through the arena, each syllable cutting deeper than the last. What Marcus didn't know was that his concert was being live-streamed to millions around the world, including a small gathering in Ouagadougou, Burkina Faso, where Ibrahim Traoré himself was watching with a group of advisors and friends. The room had fallen silent as Marcus's words filled the space, each insult landing like a physical blow. Amadou Kone, Traoré's closest advisor, reached for the remote to turn off the stream, but Traoré held up his hand. "Let it play," he said quietly, his voice carrying a weight that made everyone in the room lean forward. "Let me hear what the world really thinks of us." Back in London, Marcus was building to his crescendo. "You want to know the difference between real leaders and these pretenders? Real leaders don't need to overthrow governments to prove their worth. They don't need to blame colonialism for every problem. They take responsibility, they build solutions, they create progress. Not chaos." The crowd was split now, some cheering, others sitting in uncomfortable silence. But Marcus was too far gone to notice. He was performing for the cameras, for the clips that would go viral, for the controversy that would keep his name in the headlines for weeks. So here's to you, Ibrahim Traoré, and all the other amateur politicians playing dress-up in their fathers' countries. Maybe stick to what you know, whatever that is, and leave the real leadership to people who actually know what they're doing. As the final words left his lips, Marcus felt a strange mix of exhilaration and unease. He'd crossed lines before, but this felt different. This felt permanent. The applause that followed was scattered and uncertain, nothing like the thunderous ovations he was accustomed to. What happened next would change everything. Within hours, clips of Marcus's rant were spreading across social media like wildfire. But the response wasn't what he expected. Instead of the usual mix of outrage and support, there was something else: disappointment. Deep, cutting disappointment from fans who had looked up to him, from fellow artists who had respected his voice, from people around the world who had seen his comments not as edgy humor but as ignorant cruelty. The criticism came from everywhere. African celebrities, European intellectuals, American activists, all condemning his words as racist, ignorant, and inexcusable. But the most powerful responses came from ordinary people sharing their own stories about Traoré and what his leadership meant to them. A young woman from Burkina Faso posted a video explaining how Traoré's policies had allowed her to attend university for the first time in her family's history. A farmer shared how new agricultural initiatives had tripled his crop yield. Teachers, doctors, students, all speaking about real changes they had witnessed under Traoré's leadership. Marcus watched these responses from his hotel room, his initial defiance slowly crumbling into something approaching shame. He'd built his career on speaking truth to power, but somewhere along the way, he'd become the very thing he claimed to oppose: someone punching down at those who were actually trying to make a difference.
The breaking point came 3 days later.
Marcus was in his London apartment, staring at his phone, when a notification popped up. It was a video, tagged with thousands of mentions of his name. The thumbnail showed Ibrahim Traoré, but not in the official presidential photos Marcus had mocked. This was different, intimate, human. He clicked play. The video was shot in what appeared to be a small, simply furnished room. Traoré was sitting on a plain wooden chair, guitar in hand, no camera's crew or fancy lighting. Just him and the instrument that had been his companion long before he ever dreamed of political leadership. "I've been thinking about music lately," Traoré began, his voice soft but clear. "About how it connects us, how it transcends borders and languages and differences. How it can heal wounds that words alone cannot touch." He began to play, a simple melody, nothing complex, but there was something in the way his fingers moved across the strings that made Marcus sit up straighter. This wasn't a political statement or a public relations move. This was raw, unfiltered humanity. "A famous musician recently spoke about me," Traoré continued, his eyes never leaving the guitar. "About my qualifications, my age, my worthiness to lead. And you know what? He's not wrong to question. We should all question our leaders. We should demand better. We should expect more."
The melody grew stronger, more confident.
"But I want to tell you a story. Not about politics or policies or the complexities of governance that fill my days. I want to tell you about a young man who learned to play guitar in a refugee camp, who sang lullabies to his little sister when the bombs fell too close, who believed that music could carry hope even in the darkest times." Marcus felt something shift in his chest. This wasn't what he'd expected. There was no anger, no retaliation, no political posturing. Just a man with a guitar, sharing his truth. "Music taught me that every voice matters," Traoré continued, his fingers now dancing across the strings with growing confidence. "That a song from a village in Burkina Faso can touch hearts in London, in New York, in Tokyo. That art doesn't recognize borders or hierarchies or the artificial divisions we create between us." The melody transformed into something hauntingly beautiful, a fusion of traditional African rhythms with modern progressions that spoke to something universal in the human experience. Marcus found himself leaning forward, completely absorbed. "So when I hear criticism, when I hear doubt, when I hear someone question whether I belong in the conversations that shape our world, I don't hear an attack. I hear a call to prove worthy of the trust placed in me. I hear a challenge to be better, to do better, to serve better." Traoré's voice grew stronger, more resonant, as he began to sing. The words were in his native language at first, but even without understanding the lyrics, Marcus could feel the emotion behind them: pain, hope, determination, love. It was everything he'd been trying to capture in his own music but had lost somewhere along the way. Then Traoré switched to English, his accented words carrying a weight that made Marcus's earlier mockery seem pathetically shallow. They say I'm too young to lead, too naive to understand. But these hands have held the dying. These eyes have seen the pain. I may not have their diplomas, their pedigree or their name, but I have my people's trust, and I won't let them down again. The simplicity of the lyrics, the raw honesty in Traoré's voice, the vulnerability he was showing to the world, it cut through Marcus's defenses like nothing ever had. This wasn't a politician trying to score points or an amateur trying to prove himself. This was an artist, a real artist, using his voice to heal rather than harm. Music is the language we all speak, Traoré continued, his fingers never missing a beat. It's how we share our pain, our joy, our dreams for tomorrow. It's how we remember that beneath all our differences, we're all just human beings trying to make sense of this beautiful, complicated world. The song built to a crescendo that somehow managed to be both powerful and gentle, a perfect metaphor for the kind of leadership Traoré was trying to embody. As the final notes faded, he looked directly into the camera, his eyes carrying a mixture of sadness and forgiveness that made Marcus want to look away. To the musician who questioned my place in this world, I hear you.
I understand your doubt.
But let me ask you this. Instead of tearing each other down, what if we used our voices to lift each other up? What if we used our platforms not to divide but to unite? What if we remembered that every person, regardless of where they come from or what they look like, has something valuable to contribute to the human story? Traoré set down his guitar and leaned forward, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. Music taught me that the most powerful performances come not from perfection but from honesty, not from superiority but from vulnerability, not from looking down on others but from reaching out to them with open hands and an open heart. The video ended, but Marcus couldn't move. He sat there in his expensive apartment, surrounded by his awards and accolades, feeling smaller than he had in years. In 15 minutes, this young African leader had shown him more about artistry, about leadership, about humanity than he'd learned in decades of performing. The comments on the video were overwhelming. People from every continent sharing their own stories, their own struggles, their own hopes for a better world. Musicians offering collaborations, artists proposing exchanges, ordinary people simply saying thank you for reminding them that we're all connected. But what struck Marcus most was the complete absence of bitterness or revenge in Traoré's response. He could have destroyed Marcus with a few well-chosen words, could have mobilized his supporters to attack, could have used this moment to score political points. Instead, he'd chosen grace. He'd chosen music. He'd chosen to build bridges instead of walls. Marcus picked up his own guitar for the first time in months. His hands shook as he tried to find a melody, something that could express the shame and regret and strange new hope he was feeling.
Nothing came.
The instrument that had once been his voice now felt foreign in his hands. Over the next few days, Marcus watched his career implode in real time. Concert cancellations, radio stations dropping his music, endorsement deals disappearing. But for the first time in years, he found himself caring less about the commercial consequences and more about the human ones. The young people who had looked up to him, the fans who had trusted him to use his platform responsibly, the communities he had wounded with his careless words. He started reaching out, not to his publicist or his manager, but to people who could teach him what he'd somehow forgotten. He contacted African musicians, historians, activists. He read books, watched documentaries, listened to stories that had been there all along but that he'd been too arrogant to hear. Slowly, painfully, he began to understand the depth of his ignorance. Ibrahim Traoré wasn't just some young upstart playing at politics. He was a brilliant military strategist who had helped overthrow a corrupt government, a visionary leader implementing policies that were genuinely improving lives, a man who had sacrificed personal ambition for public service. More than that, he was exactly what Marcus had once claimed to be, an artist using his platform to challenge power and fight for justice. The difference was that Traoré was actually doing it, actually making a difference, actually putting his life on the line for his beliefs. 3 weeks after that fateful concert, Marcus made a decision that surprised everyone, including himself. He booked a flight to Burkina Faso. The journey was unlike anything he'd ever experienced. No private jets, no VIP treatment, no crowds of screaming fans. Just a nervous, humbled man on a commercial flight, trying to figure out how to apologize for wounds that words alone had created. Ouagadougou was nothing like he'd expected. Yes, there were challenges, poverty, infrastructure issues, the visible signs of a developing nation. But there was also energy, hope, a sense of possibility that he hadn't felt in his own wealthy, comfortable world in years. He'd sent word ahead through intermediaries, hoping for a meeting with Traoré but expecting nothing. To his surprise, the response came quickly. The president would see him, but not in the official palace. Instead, they would meet in a small community center where Traoré held weekly meetings with local residents. Marcus arrived early, his nerves frayed and his usual confidence nowhere to be found. The center was simple but welcoming. Plastic chairs arranged in a circle, children's drawings on the walls, the smell of tea and local spices in the air. When Traoré walked in, Marcus's first thought was how young he looked in person, how the weight of leadership seemed to rest lightly on his shoulders despite the enormous challenges he faced daily.
There was no entourage, no security detail, no ceremonial pomp.
Just a man who had come to listen to his people and had agreed to listen to a stranger who had wronged him. "Mr. Kane," Traoré said, extending his hand with a smile that seemed genuinely warm.
"Welcome to Burkina Faso.
I hope your journey was comfortable." Marcus had prepared a speech, a formal apology, a list of excuses and explanations. But faced with such simple kindness, all of that fell away. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm so incredibly sorry." Traoré nodded, gesturing for Marcus to sit. "Apologies are important," he said. "But understanding is more important."
"Tell me, what have you learned?"
For the next 2 hours, they talked. Not as politician and celebrity, not as African and European, not as young and old, but as two human beings trying to make sense of a complicated world. Marcus shared his journey from street performer to international star, how success had insulated him from the very struggles he'd once understood intimately. Traoré spoke about his own path from student to soldier to president, about the weight of representing not just his country but his generation's hopes for change. "The hardest part," Traoré said as their conversation drew to a close, "is not the criticism or the challenges or even the attempts on my life. It's the responsibility of representing hope for people who have been disappointed so many times before. Every decision I make affects millions of lives. Every word I speak can either build up or tear down the fragile trust they've placed in me." Marcus thought about his own words, about the power he'd wielded so carelessly on that London stage. "How do you carry that weight?" he asked. "Music," Traoré replied with a smile. "Music reminds me that we're all connected, that our struggles and our joys are universal. When I play guitar, when I sing, I remember that leadership isn't about being above people. It's about being among them, part of them, serving them." As Marcus prepared to leave, Traoré made an unexpected request. "Would you sing something for me?" he asked. "Something real, something that comes from your heart rather than your image."
Marcus hesitated.
He hadn't sung spontaneously, without preparation or production, in years. But something in Traoré's eyes, the same vulnerability he'd shown in that video, made him nod. He closed his eyes and let the melody come, the words flowing from some deep place he'd forgotten existed.
"He thought uno knew the word, thought he understood the pain.
But I was just a voice without a heart.
A song without a name. He built my wall so high.
I couldn't see the ground. Forgot that we're all just travelers here, trying to find our sound." When he finished, the room was quiet. Traoré nodded slowly, his eyes bright with something that might have been tears. "That," he said, "is the voice I hope to hear more of. That is the voice that can heal."
Marcus flew back to London changed.
Not just humbled or educated, but transformed in ways he was still struggling to understand. He'd met a man who embodied everything he'd claimed to believe in: authenticity, courage, service to others, and realized how far he'd strayed from those ideals. The music industry didn't welcome him back with open arms. The apology tour he embarked on was met with skepticism and, in some cases, outright hostility. But Marcus persisted, not because he was trying to salvage his career, but because he discovered something more important than fame or fortune: the possibility of using his voice for something greater than himself. He started small, benefit concerts for African development projects, collaborations with musicians from across the continent, educational programs that brought African and Western artists together. Each performance was a step toward redemption, not just for his career but for his soul. The moment that changed everything came 6 months later. Marcus was performing at a small venue in Manchester, the same city where he'd started his career decades earlier. The audience was intimate, maybe 200 people, a far cry from the stadium crowds he'd once commanded. Midway through his set, he stopped and looked out at the faces before him. "I want to tell you about a man who taught me what real leadership looks like," he said. "A man who showed me that true strength comes not from putting others down but from lifting them up." He began to play the melody Traoré had taught him, weaving it together with his own musical journey, creating something new and beautiful from the ashes of his old arrogance. As he sang, he saw tears in the audience, nods of recognition, the kind of connection he'd been searching for his entire career. "His name is Ibrahim Traoré," Marcus continued, his voice strong and clear. "And he's everything I aspired to be but was too proud to become. He's a leader who serves rather than demands to be served. He's an artist who uses his gifts to heal rather than harm."
Esse a man vu cose grace over revenge, understanding over anger, op over despair.
The audience was completely silent now, hanging on every word. This wasn't the Marcus Kane they'd known from tabloid headlines and controversy. This was someone deeper, more authentic, more human. "I mocked him once," Marcus admitted, his voice breaking slightly. "I questioned his qualifications, his age, his worthiness to lead. But in doing so, I revealed my own unworthiness to be heard. I showed the world that talent without empathy is just noise, that a platform without purpose is just vanity, that a voice without heart is just hollow sound." He played the final notes of the song, letting them hang in the air like a prayer. When he looked up, the entire audience was on their feet, not with the wild enthusiasm of his old crowds, but with something deeper: respect, understanding, genuine connection. That performance was recorded by a fan and uploaded to social media. Within days, it had been shared millions of times, not as a viral sensation but as a moment of genuine human transformation. The video made its way to Ouagadougou, where Traoré watched it with the same group of advisors who had witnessed Marcus's original attack. "He's learning," Traoré said simply. "That's all any of us can do: learn, grow, become better than we were yesterday." A month later, Marcus received an unexpected invitation. Traoré was planning a cultural festival in Burkina Faso, bringing together artists from around the world to celebrate African culture and promote understanding between different communities. Would Marcus like to participate? The festival was unlike anything Marcus had ever experienced. Musicians from every continent came together, not to compete but to collaborate, to learn from each other, to create something beautiful and unified from their diverse traditions. Marcus found himself playing alongside griots from Mali, jazz musicians from New Orleans, classical composers from Vienna, and hip-hop artists from São Paulo. But the moment that defined the entire experience came on the final night, when Traoré joined Marcus on stage for an improvised duet. The two men, who had started as adversaries, stood together before an audience of thousands, their voices and instruments weaving together in perfect harmony. They sang about forgiveness and growth, about the power of music to bridge divides, about the responsibility that comes with having a voice that others will hear. It wasn't a perfect performance. There were missed notes, forgotten lyrics, moments where the rhythm faltered. But it was real, authentic, human in a way that touched something deep in everyone who heard it. As the song ended and the audience erupted in applause, Marcus looked at Traoré and saw not a politician or a leader or even the man who had forgiven him, but an artist, a fellow traveler on the difficult journey of trying to make the world a little better through music. "Thank you," Marcus said, his words barely audible over the cheering crowd. Traoré smiled and clasped his shoulder. "Thank you for showing us that it's never too late to change, to grow, to become who we're meant to be." The festival ended, but the relationships forged there continued. Marcus found himself returning to Africa regularly, not as a tourist or a celebrity, but as a student, learning from musicians and artists who had maintained their connection to community and purpose in ways he was still struggling to understand. His career never fully recovered from that London concert. He never again commanded the massive audiences or the million-dollar contracts that had once defined his success. But he discovered something more valuable, a sense of purpose that went beyond personal achievement, a connection to something larger than himself, a voice that could heal rather than harm. Years later, when music historians wrote about the transformation of Marcus Kane, they would point to that night in London as the moment when a star fell to earth. But those who knew him better understood that it wasn't a fall at all. It was a landing, a return to the ground where real music grows, where authentic voices find their power not in elevation but in connection. And in a small office in Ouagadougou, Ibrahim Traoré continued his work of building a better future for his people, occasionally picking up his guitar to remind himself that leadership, like music, is about bringing out the best in everyone around you, about creating harmony from discord, about believing that even the most broken songs can be made beautiful again. The story of their unlikely friendship became a symbol of something larger, the possibility of redemption, the power of grace, the truth that we are all more alike than different, all struggling to find our voice in a world that often seems determined to silence us. In the end, that was the real lesson, that true strength comes not from the ability to tear others down but from the courage to lift them up, not from the power to wound but from the wisdom to heal, not from the platform to perform but from the humility to serve. And somewhere in the space between London and Ouagadougou, between mockery and grace, between falling and rising, two men found their voices and, in doing so, reminded the world that music, real music, authentic music, music that comes from the heart, has the power to transform not just individuals but entire communities, entire nations, entire ways of seeing and being in the world. Marcus Kane never again took the stage without remembering the man who had taught him that the most powerful performances come not from perfection but from honesty, not from superiority but from vulnerability, not from looking down on others but from reaching out to them with open hands and an open heart. And that, perhaps, was the most beautiful song of all. The ripples of that transformation continued to spread in ways neither Marcus nor Traoré could have anticipated. 3 years after their first meeting, Marcus received a call that would once again change the trajectory of his life. It was from Sarah Chen, a documentary filmmaker who had been following their story since that night in London. "Marcus," she said, her voice crackling through the international connection, "I've been documenting stories of reconciliation around the world, and yours with President Traoré has become something extraordinary. But I've discovered something you need to know." Marcus was in his modest apartment in Manchester, a far cry from the London penthouse he'd once called home. The walls were covered with photographs from his travels across Africa, instruments he'd collected from various cultures, and handwritten letters from young musicians who had been inspired by his transformation. "What is it, Sarah?" he asked, setting down the guitar he'd been playing, a simple acoustic instrument that Traoré had given him during their last meeting. "There's a young girl in Burkina Faso, maybe 16 years old. Her name is Aminata. She was at your original concert in London. Her family had saved for months to bring her there for her birthday. She idolized you, Marcus. She wanted to be a singer just like you." Marcus felt his chest tighten. He tried not to think too much about the individual faces in that crowd, the specific people who had heard his cruel words and been hurt by them. "When you said those things about President Traoré," Sarah continued, It broke something in her. She's from Burkina Faso originally. Her family moved to London when she was small, but they never forgot their roots. Your words made her feel ashamed of where she came from, ashamed of her heritage. She stopped singing, Marcus. She gave up her dream because her hero told the world that people like her, people from her country, weren't worth respect. The silence that followed was deafening. Marcus had spent years working to make amends for his words, but he'd focused on the big picture. The cultural exchange programs, the collaborative albums, the charity work. He'd never considered the individual dreams he might have crushed, the specific hearts he had broken. "Where is she now?" he asked quietly.
She is back in Ouagadougou.
Her family sent her there to reconnect with her culture, to heal. But she's lost, Marcus. She works in a small shop, gets by day to day, but that spark, that musical dream, it's gone. She won't even listen to music anymore. Marcus closed his eyes, feeling the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders like a physical burden. "What can I do?" "I don't know," Sarah admitted. "But I thought you should know that your journey with President Traoré isn't just about two men finding common ground. It's about all the Aminatas out there, the young people whose dreams were collateral damage in a moment of cruelty." That night, Marcus couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about a 16-year-old girl who had loved music so much that she'd convinced her family to spend their savings on a concert ticket, only to have her dreams shattered by the very person she'd admired most. He thought about all the other Aminatas he'd never heard about, the quiet casualties of his moment of arrogance. The next morning, he called Traoré directly. It was early in Burkina Faso, but the president answered on the second ring, as if he'd been expecting the call. "Ibrahim," Marcus said, his voice heavy with exhaustion and purpose, "I need your help with something."
There is a girl.
He told Traoré about Aminata, about the documentary filmmaker's discovery, about the realization that their story of reconciliation was incomplete while individual hearts remained broken. Traoré listened without interruption, his silence speaking volumes about his understanding of the situation. "I've been thinking about this a lot lately," Traoré said when Marcus finished. "About the young people who look up to us, who shape their dreams around our words and actions. We have such power to inspire or to destroy, often without even realizing it." "I want to make this right," Marcus said. "Not just for the cameras or the story, but for her. For all of them." "Then come," Traoré replied simply. "Come and we'll find her together." "But Marcus, you should know that healing someone else's dreams isn't something you can do alone. It requires community, patience, and sometimes accepting that the damage can't be completely undone." 2 weeks later, Marcus found himself walking through the dusty streets of Ouagadougou once again, but this time with a different purpose. Sarah Chan walked beside him, her camera discreetly capturing the journey, while Traoré had arranged for them to meet Aminata at a local community center where young people gathered to study and socialize. When they arrived, Aminata was sitting alone in a corner, reading a textbook. She was smaller than Marcus had imagined, with intelligent eyes that seemed older than her 16 years. When she looked up and saw him, her expression cycled through confusion, recognition, and then something that looked like pain. "Aminata," Marcus said softly, approaching her table with the same nervousness he'd felt before meeting Traoré for the first time.
My name is Marcus Kane.
"I believe you know who I am." She nodded slowly, her fingers gripping the edge of her textbook. "You're the singer," she said in accented English.
The one who.
She didn't finish the sentence, but she didn't need to. "Yes," Marcus replied, sitting down across from her. "I'm the one who said terrible things about your president, about your country, about your people."
I'm the one who hurt you.
Aminata's eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them back. "You were my favorite," she whispered. "I had all your albums. I learned to sing by copying your songs."
I dreamed of being like you someday. The words hit Marcus like physical blows.
This wasn't abstract anymore. This was real, immediate, personal. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice breaking. "I'm so incredibly sorry, Aminata. I was wrong about everything, but most of all, I was wrong to use my voice to tear people down instead of building them up." "Why did you say those things?" she asked, and there was no anger in her voice, only genuine confusion. "President Traoré is a good man. He's trying to help our country. Why did you mock him?" Marcus struggled to find words that could explain the inexplicable. "Because I was scared," he said finally. "Scared that the world was changing, that young people like you and leaders like President Traoré were showing me how irrelevant my old way of thinking had become. So instead of learning and growing, I lashed out. I tried to make myself feel bigger by making others feel smaller." Aminata was quiet for a long moment, studying his face as if trying to determine whether his words were genuine. "I stopped singing after that night," she said eventually. "Every time I tried, I heard your voice saying that people like me, people from places like this, weren't worth listening to." "But that's the opposite of the truth," Marcus said urgently. "Your voice, your perspective, your music, they're exactly what the world needs. I was the one who wasn't worth listening to that night." At that moment, Traoré appeared at their table, his presence immediately shifting the dynamic in the room. Aminata's face lit up with genuine admiration and respect, a stark contrast to the wariness she'd shown toward Marcus. "Mr. President," she said, standing quickly, "I didn't know you were coming." "Please sit," Traoré said gently.
"And call me Ibrahim."
"We're all just people here, trying to understand each other." He turned to Marcus.
"Have you heard Aminata sing?"
Marcus shook his head, and Traoré smiled. "She performed at a youth event I attended 2 years ago, before." He paused meaningfully. "She has a voice that could move mountains." "I don't sing anymore," Aminata said quickly, her cheeks flushing with embarrassment. "Why not?" Traoré asked, though they all knew the answer. "Because." Aminata struggled for words. "Because he said we weren't good enough. That our leaders were jokes, that our culture was backwards, that people like us didn't belong in important conversations." Traoré nodded thoughtfully. "And what do you think now? Do you believe those words were true?" Aminata looked between the two men, her internal struggle visible on her face.
"I don't know what to believe anymore."
"Then let me tell you what I believe," Traoré said, his voice taking on the warm, authoritative tone that had made him such an effective leader. "I believe that every voice has value, that every dream deserves a chance, that every young person has something unique to contribute to the world. I also believe that we all make mistakes, that we all say things we regret, and that we all deserve the opportunity to learn and grow from our failures." He gestured toward Marcus. "This man hurt you with his words. But he's also spent the last 3 years trying to make amends, not just with grand gestures, but with real work, real change, real growth. The question isn't whether he deserves your forgiveness. That's entirely up to you. The question is whether you're going to let his moment of ignorance define your entire future." Marcus watched this exchange with growing amazement. Traoré wasn't just defending him or pushing for easy reconciliation. He was challenging Aminata to reclaim her own power, to decide for herself what her dreams were worth. "I'm scared," Aminata admitted, her voice barely above a whisper.
"What if I'm not good enough?"
"What if the world really doesn't want to hear what I have to say?" "There's only one way to find out," Marcus said, surprising himself with his boldness.
"Sing for Stati Uniti."
"Right here, right now. Not because you have to, not because we're asking you to forgive or forget, but because music is who you are, and no one, not me, not anyone, has the right to take that away from you." Aminata looked around the community center, at the other young people who had gradually gathered to witness this unusual meeting. Some of them had their phones out, recording, but most were simply watching with the kind of intense attention that comes when something important is happening. "I don't have my guitar," she said, and Marcus could hear the longing in her voice. "Use mine," he offered, reaching for the instrument Traoré had given him. As he handed it to her, their fingers brushed, and he felt the significance of the moment, passing not just an instrument but a responsibility, a opportunity, a chance for redemption that belonged to both of them. Aminata held the guitar like she was reuniting with an old friend. Her fingers found the strings instinctively, and even before she began to play, Marcus could see the transformation beginning. This was who she was meant to be. She started with a simple melody, something traditional that spoke to her roots, her heritage, the culture that Marcus had once dismissed so callously. Her voice, when it came, was everything Traoré had promised: rich, soulful, carrying the weight of experience that seemed impossible for someone so young. She sang in her native language first, the words flowing like water, like wind, like something elemental and eternal. Then, gradually, she transitioned to English, her accent adding a unique texture to the familiar language. "They tried to tell me I was small, that my voice didn't matter at all, that dreams from here don't reach the sky, that girls like me shouldn't even try. But I am the daughter of the desert, the child of ancient songs.
My voice carries the wisdom of my mothers,
the strength of those who came before. I am not small, I am not silent, I am not less than anyone else. I am the music of my people.
I am the story of myself."
As she sang, something shifted in the room. The other young people began to move closer, some humming along, others simply swaying to the rhythm. Marcus felt tears streaming down his face, not just from guilt or regret but from pure, overwhelming beauty of what he was witnessing. This wasn't just a song, it was a reclamation, a declaration of independence, a young woman taking back her power from someone who had tried to steal it from her. It was everything Marcus had spent years trying to learn about using music to heal rather than harm. When the song ended, the silence that followed was profound. Then, slowly, the applause began, not the wild, screaming adulation Marcus was used to, but something deeper, more meaningful. It was the sound of recognition, of respect, of a community welcoming back one of its own. "That," Traoré said, his own voice thick with emotion, "is what real music sounds like. That is the voice our world needs to hear." Marcus nodded, unable to speak. He had come here hoping to offer something to Aminata, to find some way to repair the damage his words had caused. Instead, she had given him something far more valuable, a reminder of why music mattered, of what authentic artistry looked like, of the power that came from staying connected to one's roots and community. "Thank you," he managed to say finally, "for showing me what I'd forgotten, for reminding me why we sing in the first place." Aminata looked at him with eyes that were older now, wiser for having faced her fears and emerged stronger. "I'm not ready to forgive you yet," she said honestly. "Maybe I never will be. But I'm ready to stop letting your words define my future." "That's more than I deserve," Marcus replied, "and more than I dared to hope for." Over the following weeks, as Sarah Chan continued documenting their story, something unexpected began to happen. Aminata's performance at the community center, captured on dozens of phones and shared across social media, began to go viral. But this wasn't the manufactured, fleeting fame that Marcus had once chased. This was organic, authentic, driven by people who recognized something real and valuable when they heard it. Record labels began reaching out, offering contracts and promises of stardom. But Aminata, guided by the wisdom of her community and the hard-learned lessons of Marcus's journey, chose a different path. She decided to stay in Burkina Faso, to build her career from the ground up, to use her voice to amplify the stories of her people rather than abandoning them for international fame. Marcus watched this unfold with a mixture of admiration and regret. Admiration for her wisdom, regret for the years he'd wasted chasing the wrong things. He began to split his time between Europe and Africa, not as a celebrity seeking redemption, but as a student learning from artists who had maintained their integrity in ways he was still struggling to understand. The documentary that Sarah Chen eventually produced wasn't the simple story of forgiveness and reconciliation that people expected. It was something more complex, more honest, an examination of how words can wound, how power can corrupt, and how the long journey back to authenticity requires not just individual transformation but community support and collective healing. When the film premiered at film festivals around the world, it sparked conversations about responsibility, about the power of platforms, about the difference between celebrity and true artistry. But for Marcus, the most meaningful screening was the one held in that same community center in Ouagadougou, where Aminata had first found her voice again. As the credits rolled and the audience discussed what they'd seen, Marcus noticed Aminata sitting quietly in the back, her guitar in her lap. She was humming something new, something he'd never heard before. "What's that song?" he asked, approaching her cautiously. She looked up with a smile that held no trace of the pain he'd once caused. "It's about second chances," she said. "About how sometimes the worst things that happen to us can become the catalyst for the best things. About how even broken songs can find new harmonies." Marcus felt a warmth spread through his chest, a sense of completion he'd been searching for without even realizing it. "Would you teach it to me sometime?" he asked. Aminata considered this for a moment, then nodded. "Yes," she said. "I think I would like that. But you have to promise me something." "Anything. Promise me that you'll never forget where real music comes from. Not from stages or studios or record labels, but from here." She placed her hand over her heart. "From the place where our pain and our joy and our hope all live together. That's where the songs that matter are born." Marcus nodded, understanding finally what Traoré had been trying to teach him from the beginning. Music wasn't about being heard by the most people or making the most money or even being the most talented. It was about connection, about truth, about using whatever gifts you had to make the world a little more beautiful, a little more understanding, a little more whole. As he looked around that community center, at the faces of young people who were just beginning their own musical journeys, at Traoré who was listening to their conversations with the same attention he gave to matters of state, at Aminata who had transformed from victim to teacher in the span of a few short years, Marcus realized that this was where he belonged. Not at the top of the charts or the center of attention, but here, among people who understood that the most powerful performances happen not when you're trying to prove how great you are, but when you're trying to serve something greater than yourself. The boy who had once buskied on the streets of Manchester, who had dreamed of fame and fortune and all the glittering prizes the music industry had to offer, was finally home. Not in a place, but in a purpose. Not in success, but in service. Not in the spotlight, but in the community of souls who understood that music, real music, authentic music, was never about the singer. It was always about the song, and the people who needed to hear it, and the healing that happened when voices came together in harmony rather than discord. And in that moment, surrounded by the quiet conversations and gentle laughter of people who had chosen connection over competition, Marcus Kane finally understood what it meant to find his voice. Not the voice that demanded attention or proved superiority, but the voice that offered comfort, that built bridges, that sang the world back together one note at a time. The song continued, as it always had and always would, carried forward by each new generation of dreamers and believers and healers who understood that music was bigger than any individual, more powerful than any platform, more lasting than any moment of fame or failure. And Marcus, for the first time in his life, was content to be simply one voice in that eternal chorus, adding his small part to the symphony of human connection that had been playing long before he arrived and would continue long after he was gone.